I'm a full-time photo and videographer, and I've been color grading for a few years now. Now, I'm by no means a pro, but I have been doing this for a little bit, so I know a few tips that should be able to catch you up to speed. So if you're looking to improve, then you've came to the right place. I'm going to be going over some quick tips and a lot of common mistakes that a lot of newer people make when they're starting out.
All right, so real quick, I'm over here at my desktop setup. It's not, it's not the nicest looking. I'm getting to it. Anyway, so there's one concept I want to go over that's really important for you to understand before you start color grading. We'll go with that. It's the difference between color correction and color grading. So color correction is when you bring your footage into Premiere or whatever space you're using, DaVinci Resolve, whatever you're using. I'm personally going to be using Premiere for this. It's when you bring it in, say you're shooting in log format, the log color space, and you're going to be translating that to a more neutral tone, which is more editable, you know what I mean? More editable, and this is where your color grading comes into play. Now, your color grading is a more stylistic part of it, the more fun part of it, where color correction is the more like trying to make the footage as neutral as possible. So then once you get to that point where it is neutral, you're going to be taking that footage, and that's when the color grading begins. You're going to be putting your style onto it, your more creative side of the footage. And that's just kind of the basic concept between the two, and you should know that before you get into it. All right, so let's hop into Premiere right now. All right, so welcome to Premiere. So I'm starting with my footage. I brought it in. I got this footage from the Black Magic Design website. It's some sample log footage because I don't have log footage of my own that I can use real quick. So I just wanted to grab some. So usually if you're shooting in log, this is like what you're gonna see. You're gonna pull it in and it's gonna look like this. And you're probably like, well, that's not what it looked like. That's not how I shot it. Well, yeah, you shot it in log. So I'm going to go over the color correction part of transforming something from log footage to look pretty normal, pretty neutral. And then we're going to go a little bit more into the color grading after that. So real quick, just to really very basics for LUMETRI scopes on which you should know about if you are doing color grading. So right here, I have the scopes pulled up, and how they work pretty much is at the top is your highlights, at the bottom are your darks. If you have something that's very overexposed, that's where all your that's where your scopes are all going to go. They're all going to go to the top, which you don't really want. And if you're very underexposed, it's going to go all the way to the bottom, which you don't really want. So you kind of want something a little bit in between, in the middle of the scopes. That's your kind of go-to and what you're aiming for when I say color correcting. And let's start off with curves. Now, curves are I want to say they're an intimidating tool. I think as a beginner, if you're stepping into color correcting, you're a little intimidated by curves, or at least I was. And I don't know if that is for everybody. So very quick, this is your curves. It's very simple. And now what I like to do is just do a nice little S curve. So usually we're going to pull up our highlights, give it a little contrast, pull it down. So now you see that the curved line, it looks a little bit like an S. Now, it doesn't look exactly the best yet, but we're still working on that. So pretty much what I'm looking for here is this bottom one. I'm looking for like the dark. So like the dark in the shirt. I don't want it to be like, you can't really see the shadows. The shadows are kind of like overexposed. It's not really, the shadows aren't real. So I'm looking to pull this down until I can see realer shadows, something like that. Now this color is starting to look a little bit more accurate. So yeah, all right, I usually start off with the curves. This is okay for me. I'm gonna do more adjusting to it. Now also another thing that I like to do is your white balance. Now your white balance is really important in your color correcting space because it's kind of a tricky one because you're correcting the color, which can, you can kind of go into like, this is like kind of color grading, but I like to make it as neutral as possible using the white balance tool. So right here, I'm just going to grab it and I'll click on the tarp. It's pretty neutral. It was already pretty neutral. So that works for me. Now going back to our curves tool real quick and how I was talking about our real whites and our real blacks. Something you're going to want to do is you're going to want to do this little curve. So if you go to your LUMAVSSAT, just do this little curve. It kind of helps with your blacks, your shadows, and also helps with your highlights, giving it a more consistent feel, a more consistent feeling. So if you're doing this with all of your footage, it will kind of give it a more consistent feeling across the board, which is something you want to kind of shoot for when you're shooting. So now let's hop into the color grading aspect of the footage. So we have this base here that is looking pretty good to me personally. And now this is where we can get a little bit more creative. All right, so let's head into our HSL secondary tool. So what you're basically doing is you're trying to select all of the colors behind your subject's face, so it keeps your subject's face the same tone, but we're going to be messing around with the background color. Kind of a little bit of a weird aperture effect going on here, but let's not get into it too much. So basically the way that I do it is I take our set color tool, I go over to the footage and I click on the subject's face usually, and to see what we have selected, we'll slide over our denoise tool. So something I have skipped here is I have this selected. So if you do select it, you might see something like this, having everything selected. And what you're going to want to do is just hit this button right here, make sure it's blue. And now we can just play with this a little bit, make sure. So it looks like the subject's skin for the most part is all selected. So when we go down to our correction tab on the HSL selection, when we mess around with this, it should mess around with the colors behind and kind of keep the subject's face the same tone as it was. So you can kind of just like mess around with this wheel, see what kind of color you want to go into. Now this is something where like your color theory would come into play. Like teal and orange is very common in the film industry. So it's something you're going to want to do here. So I like to give it like a nice little blue background, mess around with it a little bit. And then I come in here and we can kind of make it look like it's like the afternoon, the sun's going down, or we can make it look like it's midday if we mess around with the temperature a little bit. But I'm going to go with this like sundown effect. I like to add a little bit of contrast and sharpen it. Now there's some more you can do in terms of the teal and the orange effect. You can mask in more of an orange on the subject's face to really give it that orange and teal contrast. I'm not going to do that with this tutorial, but I can definitely go into it in a different one. I personally have been messing around with some saturation and more of my like editing style, so I've been bumping that up a lot. So usually I'm going to go with like something like 150. But it's looking okay. The subject's face is a little cold, and I don't know how I feel about that. It's definitely something I would mess around with a little bit more in post, but this is honestly looking pretty good. Looking at the footage, you know, I would need to render it a little bit so it looks a little nicer on my current setup, but this is pretty good. Like we went from something that was this to something that was this, and I'm pretty happy with that.